On the cold morning of October 14, 1066, the winds sweeping across the fields of Hastings carried more than the smell of damp earth. They carried the weight of a continent about to be reshaped by a single man, William, Duke of Normandy. Before the sun set that day, King Harold Godwinson would lie dead with an arrow in his eye. The English crown would be ripped from Saxon hands, and Europe would witness the birth of a ruler whose methods would leave nations trembling for generations. William did not merely become king. He took England, and the brutality that followed shocked even a medieval world accustomed to violence. To understand the horrifying acts William committed as he built his empire, you must first understand the boy who grew into the conqueror. William was born in 1028, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert the Magnificent and a woman named Herliva. Because of his birth, Normans called him William the Bastard, a name that followed him like a curse. Yet from childhood he learned something vital. Survival demanded ruthlessness. When he was only 7, his father died on pilgrimage and left him Duke of Normandy. What followed was nearly a decade of chaos. Norman nobles tried to kill the boy repeatedly. His guardians were murdered one after another. Assassins roamed the roads at night. Plots curled through castles like smoke. William grew up sleeping with armed guards at his doors and daggers under his pillow. This childhood shaped a ruler who trusted few, forgave none, and crushed any threat with overwhelming force. By the time he reached adulthood, William had regained control through decisive and often brutal strikes against rebellious barons. But his ambition reached past Normandy's borders. His eyes fixed on one prize, the throne of England. In early 1066, King Edward the Confessor died without a direct heir. According to Norman chroniclers such as William of Poitiers and Orderic Vitalis, Edward had once promised the throne to William. Whether this was true or political propaganda will forever remain debated. But what is certain is that Harold Godwinson, the most powerful Saxon noble, seized the crown for himself. When Harold did that, he made a dangerous enemy. William claimed Harold had sworn loyalty to him years earlier. The oath, reportedly taken on sacred relics, became the moral justification William needed. But behind the religious language was the reality. William intended to take England by force, and he prepared for it with astonishing precision. Throughout 1066, William assembled one of the most formidable invasion fleets Europe had ever seen. Ships were constructed across Normandy's coast, soldiers recruited from France, Flanders, and Brittany, and papal approval secured from Rome. When William sailed, he did so under a banner blessed by the Pope himself. This turned his invasion into a holy cause, making resistance to him not just rebellion but sacrilege. After crossing the Channel in late September 1066, William built a fort at Pevensey, then marched inland. The stage was set. However, William's conquest of England did not end at Hastings. That battle was only the beginning. The horrors that followed shaped the next 2 decades of England's history and revealed the darkest side of the man who became its king. The first shocking act came immediately after victory. William did not rush to London or seek peace. Instead, he burned towns along the way, including Romney and Dover, killing civilians and destroying property. Medieval chroniclers describe how entire villages were left smoking ruins, punishment for resisting Norman authority or simply being in the path of his army. William understood psychological warfare. He wanted England terrified long before he reached its capital. On Christmas Day, 1066, inside Westminster Abbey, William was crowned King of England, but even his coronation became a scene of panic and destruction. When Norman guards outside the abbey heard shouts from within, they believed an assassination was underway. They reacted by burning nearby houses to the ground. Londoners fled in terror. Thus William began his reign with fire. These incidents were only a glimpse of what was to come. William ruled with an iron fist, determined to crush every spark of rebellion. Over the next several years, he committed 7 acts so brutal, so shocking, that even medieval writers described them with horror. These were not just political decisions. They were calculated displays of fear, force, and domination. The first major rebellion erupted in 1067 and 1068. The Saxons were not ready to accept Norman rule, and William responded with swift executions and mass confiscations of land. Yet compared to what happened later, these punishments were mild. William had not yet reached the full height of his fury. That fury exploded in 1069, when northern England rose against him with support from Viking forces. What followed became one of the most infamous events in British history, the Harrying of the North. William's response was not a military campaign, it was annihilation. He ordered entire regions burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered, villages razed, wells poisoned. Anyone suspected of aiding rebels was killed. Chroniclers estimated that more than 100,000 people starved to death as winter swept across the ruined landscape. Skeletons littered the fields, corpses were left unburied. For decades the land remained barren. This was only one of the 7 acts that shocked Europe, and only the beginning of the terror William unleashed as he solidified his power. But before diving into each of those specific actions, it is important to understand why William ruled this way. The Norman world was built on fear and loyalty. Rebellion was a mortal threat. Mercy was considered weakness. William believed that a king must rule with absolute control or lose his throne. To him, brutality was not cruelty. It was strategy, a necessary force to bend a conquered people to obedience. By the early 1070s, William had transformed England completely. Saxon nobles were replaced by Norman lords. Castles rose across the country as symbols of domination. Forests were seized for royal hunting grounds, and strict laws enforced violent punishments for poaching. Taxes were increased, freedoms restricted. The Saxon identity itself was crushed under the weight of Norman authority. Yet despite his harshness, William reshaped England in ways that influenced the continent. He introduced centralized government, reformed the church, and strengthened the monarchy. But these reforms came at a cost paid in blood and suffering. Europe watched with both awe and fear. Never before had a ruler so effectively combined administrative genius with ruthless cruelty. And the 7 horrific actions that shocked Europe reveal exactly how William used terror as a tool of power. This is the world we now enter, a world ruled by a man forged in violence, hardened by survival, and determined to control a kingdom through fear. In the bitter winter of 1069, the winds rolling down from the Yorkshire hills carried a warning: smoke, ash, silence where villages once stood. William the Conqueror had arrived in the north of England, and with him came a fury so devastating that even hardened medieval chroniclers wrote of it with trembling hands. The event would be remembered as the Harrying of the North, the first and most infamous of the 7 horrific acts that shocked Europe. But to understand William's brutality, you must understand what drove him to it. The North had always been distant from London, a region with its own culture, loyalties, and scars from centuries of Viking rule. William's victory at Hastings might have won him a crown, but it had not won him obedience. In 1069, when the people of York rose in rebellion with support from Danish forces, William interpreted the uprising not simply as treason, but as a personal challenge to his authority, and William never allowed a challenge to go unanswered. He marched north with a hardened army of Normans and mercenaries. Chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis described his men as wolves descending on a flock. Once William reached York, he spared no one, not rebels. Not farmers, not children, not elders. Entire districts were emptied. What began as a military operation became a systematic destruction of life. This was the first horrific act. William ordered villages burned to the ground. Fields and orchards were set on fire, livestock slaughtered or carried off, every store of grain destroyed, wells contaminated, people fleeing the flames were hunted down, others froze or starved as winter deepened. The aim was clear. William did not want to defeat the North, he wanted to erase it. Even Norman chroniclers who supported him admitted that more than 100,000 people died from starvation alone. For decades afterward, travelers described stretches of wasteland where no crops grew and no villagers lived. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, recorded entire regions as waste. These were not just empty lands. They were scars. Europe was horrified. Kings, bishops, and monks condemned the scale of William's destruction. This was not war. It was annihilation, a devastation so complete that it bordered on the unimaginable for the time. But for William, it was necessary. He believed ruthlessness was the only language a rebel understood, and the harrying was only the beginning. Once the North lay in ruins, William moved to ensure that no one else in England could rise against him. The second horrific act came through the mass seizure of land. William stripped Saxon nobles of nearly all their holdings and gave them to Norman knights, allies, and relatives. According to the Domesday records, by the end of his reign, only a tiny fraction of English land remained in native hands. But the land seizure was not just economic or political. It was enforced through cruelty. Anyone resisting had their homes burned or were expelled from their estates. Families that had held land for generations found themselves reduced to peasantry overnight. And in cases of rebellion, William ordered a punishment that shocked even his own barons: blinding. This formed the third horrific act. When rebels in the region of Ely resisted Norman control under the leadership of Hereward the Wake, William responded with savage efficiency. Captured rebels were not executed. Execution was too simple. Instead, William ordered that their eyes be put out. Blinding was a permanent mark of humiliation in medieval society, a reminder of disloyalty burned into one's very body. The punishment was intended to break the spirit of resistance. Chroniclers noted that after one uprising, hundreds of men were blinded and left to wander, helpless, dependent, and terrified. Villages seeing these broken survivors understood the message. William tolerated no rebellion. Loyalty, in his world, was enforced through fear carved into flesh. The fourth horrific act was William's introduction of forest laws. After taking the throne, William declared vast swaths of land as royal forests, especially in Hampshire and neighbouring counties. But these forests were not merely wooded lands. They included entire villages, farms, and estates. When William claimed these lands, the people living there were expelled without compensation. More shocking were the laws themselves. Under William's forest laws, killing a deer was not a hunting violation. It was a crime punishable by mutilation. A man caught hunting could have his hands or eyes removed. If he resisted, the punishment was harsher still. Ordinary people were forbidden even from carrying bows in forest regions. These forests became the domain of the king alone, guarded by enforcers empowered to punish with brutality. The people saw the forests not as symbols of royalty, but of tyranny. Yet Europe, at this point, had already begun to view William with fear and wonder. His power was unmatched, his authority unquestioned, but his reign continued to reveal more acts that pushed the boundaries of medieval cruelty. The fifth horror was the building of castles across England. On the surface, castles were tools of military power, but the way William used them turned them into symbols of oppression. Towering structures like the Tower of London were built to dominate the population, not protect them. Villagers were forced into labor, homes demolished to clear land for construction, families evicted so Norman garrisons could occupy the area. Castles rose like fangs across the English landscape, each one a reminder of conquest. Chroniclers wrote that no Englishman could walk a day's journey without seeing a Norman lord's fortress towering over the horizon. The sixth horrific act was William's treatment of hostages. When he took control of England, he demanded hostages from noble families as guarantees of loyalty. But when any family rebelled, William ordered the hostages mutilated or executed. Some were imprisoned in dungeons, chained, starved, or tortured. Hostages included not only men, but sometimes boys barely old enough to speak clearly. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty was not optional. It was mandatory, enforced by terror. And then came the seventh act, one that Europeans whispered about in dread. William's retribution against those who opposed his authority in Normandy itself. When he returned to the continent to secure his holdings there, he waged a campaign with the same severity he inflicted on England. Towns that resisted were burned. Nobles who conspired against him were executed or dispossessed. Critics of Norman chroniclers wrote that William ruled Normandy with a mailed fist, crushing rebellions with a brutality that even war-hardened knights feared, but among these seven, the harrying of the north remained the most infamous. No other act in William's career revealed so clearly the depth of his resolve and the magnitude of his fury. For him, power was not maintained by diplomacy, it was maintained by fear, and fear required demonstration. By the late 1070s, William had crushed every rebellion in England. The Saxon aristocracy was dismantled. Norman rule was absolute. Europe looked on with a mixture of horror and awe. A new king had reshaped England through blood, fire, starvation, mutilation, and iron control. And though William's reign brought administrative order and cultural transformation, it was built on a foundation soaked in suffering. This was William the Conqueror's rise into legend, not through mercy, but through terror. By the early 1070s, England no longer felt like a Saxon kingdom. It felt like a conquered land reshaped under the weight of steel, stone, and relentless fear. Villages still whispered of William's fury in the north, describing burned fields and empty hamlets where only wind and ash remained. But while the harrying of the north was the most devastating act William committed, it was far from the last. His campaign to dominate England continued in quieter but equally terrifying ways. One symbol of this new age towered over London, a massive stone fortress rising above the Thames. This structure would become the heart of William's fifth horrific act, though in his day it was simply called the White Tower. Today the world knows it as the Tower of London. The tower was not built for beauty or comfort. It was built to intimidate. Its walls rose higher than anything the Saxons had ever seen. Its windows were narrow and dark. Its gates were strengthened with iron. When the local population watched Norman troops carve out land, demolish Saxon homes, and lay the foundations of this fortification, they understood that this was not just a castle, it was a message. William wanted every Englishman to know that rebellion was not only futile, but suicidal. Construction began soon after William took the throne. Saxon labourers were forced to carry stone, dig trenches, and transport timber. Many were beaten or whipped for slow work. Entire neighbourhoods were displaced so that Norman soldiers could guard the site. Chroniclers wrote that Londoners lived in fear of the fortress, convinced that the king intended it as a prison for anyone who opposed him. They were right. Over the following decades, the tower held hostages, rebels, and nobles whose loyalty wavered. While the tower physically dominated the landscape, another one of William's horrific acts reached into every household and every village across the kingdom. In 1085, he ordered a survey unlike anything Europe had ever seen. It became known as the Domesday Survey, and it formed his sixth terrifying action. On the surface, the Domesday Book was an administrative record, but its true purpose ran deeper. William wanted total control. The survey counted every acre of land, every animal, every mill, every plough, and every man. Nothing escaped the king's knowledge. Norman officials travelled from town to town, demanding information under oath. Anyone caught lying faced punishment. Entire communities were interrogated. Some Saxons described the experience as Judgment Day itself, a divine reckoning in which no secret could remain hidden. The name Domesday came later, but it reflected exactly how people felt. When William asked for information, it was not a request. It was a command backed by the threat of mutilation or imprisonment. The survey allowed William to calculate taxes, seize land more efficiently, and ensure absolute control over England's economy. This act shocked Europe because it revealed the scope of William's authority. No medieval king had ever attempted such a vast, intrusive study of their kingdom. It demonstrated a level of organization and dominance that made other rulers uneasy. For the English, the message was clear. William knew everything, and a king who knew everything could punish anything. But William's dominance was not limited to walls and books. It lived in the silence he imposed on the land. Norman chroniclers often wrote admiringly of the peace that followed William's conquest. But this peace did not grow from justice or stability. It grew from fear. The Saxons lived under a quiet terror, where even speaking against the king brought danger. Many Englishmen were afraid to gather in groups, fearing Norman suspicion. Monks wrote in secret about the suffering of the people. A single rumor of rebellion could lead to mass arrests or worse. In parts of the country, William established new laws that disproportionately targeted Saxons. If a Norman was murdered, the entire village could be fined unless they produced the killer. This law, known as the Murdrum Law, made every English community collectively responsible for the safety of Norman occupiers. Innocent families often paid heavy penalties for crimes they did not commit. It was a form of collective punishment that kept Saxons constantly on edge. This created a society in which the conquerors walked freely while the conquered lived in dread. Yet despite the fear, rebellion still simmered under the surface. England was a proud land with centuries of tradition. The Saxons were not content to bow forever. They resisted through small acts, secret meetings, hidden weapons, quiet prayers for Norman downfall. William knew this, and so he continued to rule with harsh precision. Meanwhile, on the continent, William's reputation was growing. Kings and nobles across Europe wrote letters expressing both admiration and concern. Some feared that William would turn his ambition toward their lands next. Others saw him as a model of effective, if ruthless, governance. Stories of his campaigns spread across monasteries, courts, and markets. Tales of burned villages, blinded rebels, and starved regions shocked listeners, but they also impressed them. Few rulers in Europe could maintain such unchallenged command. Despite his power, William remained deeply insecure. His childhood had taught him that danger could strike at any moment. He trusted almost no one. He traveled with armed guards. He punished threats with immediate force. Even his sons were treated with suspicion. This paranoia contributed to another layer of cruelty in his reign. Hostages taken from noble families were treated harshly, often imprisoned in deplorable conditions. These hostages were not criminals. They were leverage. If their relatives misbehaved, the hostages paid the price. Sometimes this meant starvation, sometimes mutilation, sometimes death. Europe reacted with horror to these policies, especially when hostages were children. Medieval warfare was brutal, but harming noble hostages violated old traditions of honor. William broke these traditions without hesitation. By the mid-1080s, the English population had been reshaped entirely. Norman lords controlled almost all land. The church had been restructured to serve Norman interests. Castles dotted the landscape like a net of stone. Laws favored the conquerors, and the Saxon language, once the tongue of kings, was pushed to the homes of peasants. William's England was a kingdom built on dominance, fear, and relentless order, but his horrific acts were not finished. His final years would reveal a man whose ambition extended beyond England, whose authority shaped Europe, and whose cruelty did not weaken as he aged. Instead, his temper grew sharper, his punishments more severe, and his legacy more complicated. And as William approached the end of his life, a final series of decisions would complete the list of horrors that defined his reign. By the late 1080s, William the Conqueror was no longer the fierce young duke, who rode into battle with unshakable confidence. He was older, heavier, and more suspicious than ever, yet his ruthlessness had only sharpened with age. The final years of his reign revealed the last of the horrific acts that shocked Europe, completing the legacy of a king who conquered not only a nation, but the very spirit of its people. The seventh and final major horror began in *** 1087 ***, when William launched a brutal campaign into the French region of Vexin. Though his enemies were French nobles, not English rebels, William unleashed the same merciless tactics he had used throughout England. Villages accused of supporting rebels were burned to ash. Farmland was trampled beneath marching boots. Churches were ransacked, and civilians fled into forests seeking safety that never came. The fire William ordered spread so fiercely that it scorched the landscape, leaving entire districts charred. But fate turned this final campaign against him. As William rode through the burning ruins of the town of Mantes, his horse stumbled on smouldering debris. The king was thrown violently forward, crushing his abdomen on the saddle. Medieval writers described how the injury caused slow, agonizing internal damage. In a striking twist of poetic justice, the conqueror who had burned thousands died from a wound caused by fire and devastation he himself had unleashed. William was taken to Rouen, where he was placed in a monastery to await death. The king who had commanded armies now struggled to breathe. As his body weakened, he tried to make peace with God. He ordered the release of prisoners and promised mercy to those he had wronged. But these gestures came too late. His long years of cruelty had created enemies across the continent. Even in death, William's story remained tragic, shocking, and strangely symbolic of his violent rule. When William died in September 1087, his attendants fled. They stripped the room of valuables, leaving the king's body abandoned. This act stunned chroniclers. It showed that even those closest to him had feared him rather than loved him. William's corpse lay unattended for hours until clergy arrived to prepare him for burial. But the horrors did not end there. During his funeral in Keene, a fire broke out in the surrounding town. Smoke poured into the church. Even then, mourners felt the familiar sting of destruction that had followed William's armies for decades. As the monks lowered his body into the tomb, another disaster struck. The corpse, swollen from his injury, did not fit into the stone sarcophagus. When attendants forced it inside, the body ruptured, filling the church with a stench so foul that those present fled retching. Chroniclers recorded this moment in disturbing detail. Europe interpreted it as a sign that even in burial, William's legacy remained marked by ruin and decay. But beyond the grisly scenes, William's final years had already cemented his reputation as one of medieval Europe's most terrifying rulers. His 7 horrific acts could be felt everywhere in England. The harrying of the north left deep scars that lasted generations. Families who survived the famine never recovered their lost lands. The once thriving north became a region associated with poverty and destruction for decades. Bards and monks told stories of the burned villages, the starved children, and the cold winter where corpses lay frozen in the fields. The blinding of rebels remained one of the darkest symbols of William's reign. Many of those mutilated survivors wandered the countryside long after, living reminders of what rebellion cost. The forest laws reshaped entire regions. Thousands of acres became forbidden. Ordinary people were banished from lands their ancestors had farmed for centuries. The penalties for hunting remained harsh, and locals lived in fear of royal foresters who enforced the laws with brutality. The building of castles reshaped England's skyline. These fortresses were not homes. They were instruments of psychological control. Many Saxons viewed them as foreign invaders made of stone. In the shadow of these towers, Saxon culture slowly disappeared. Norman French became the language of the elite, the church, and the courts. Within a generation, England itself was transformed. The Domesday Survey shocked Europe with its thoroughness. It became a tool of taxation, control, and domination. Nothing was too small for the king's attention. Even a single goat or a single millstone was recorded. Europe's nobles feared that William's administrative ambition would inspire other rulers to tighten their authority as well, and the harsh treatment of hostages, especially children, left nobles across the continent wary. William's willingness to punish families for the crimes of individuals broke long-standing traditions of honor and negotiation. Together, these actions built a kingdom of silence. England became a place where rebellion meant starvation, mutilation, or annihilation. William's rule stabilized the nation, but it did so through fear. His authority was absolute because his punishments were absolute, yet history's judgment of William remains complex. For all his cruelty, he changed England in ways that shaped its future. He centralized power, reformed the church, reorganized land ownership, and laid the foundations for a new aristocracy. His administrative skills were unmatched. Europe watched as England transformed into a more structured, more powerful kingdom. But this evolution came with an immense human cost. Medieval Europe was a violent world, yet William's methods stood out even then. Chroniclers who admired him still described his actions with shock. Monks wrote that God tolerated his success only to punish England for its sins. Others claimed that William's victories proved divine favor, while his cruelties proved divine wrath. Even centuries later, English history could not forget him. His shadow remained in popular stories, in burned lands, in ruined villages, and in memories passed down through generations. The Tower of London, one of his greatest symbols of domination, remained a place of fear for centuries. It became a prison for queens, princes, and traitors, fulfilling exactly the role William intended. And the Domesday Book still exists today, a monumental reminder of how deeply William sought to control every inch of his kingdom. In the end, William the Conqueror earned his name not simply because he won a battle in 1066. He earned it because he conquered England completely, reshaping it with blood, fire, fear, and unyielding authority. His 7 horrific acts shocked Europe not only for their cruelty, but for their effectiveness. Few rulers in medieval history demonstrated such absolute power. As his body decayed inside a stone tomb in Keene, his legacy continued to grow. England could not escape the mark he left. Europe could not ignore the lessons he taught, and history could not forget the ruler who forged a kingdom through terror as much as through strategy. William's story is a reminder of the brutal realities of medieval power. A king could build a nation, but he could also break a people, and sometimes, as in William's case, he did both at once.